Let me see. I have to go back. Right. The law of monophyly. I think we have a little misunderstanding of it. Let me try to explain it. All the descendants of a clade, regardless of how much they've changed, would remain members of that clade. That's just the law of monophyly right there. Um, the reason why, when asked, for example, between whales and pine trees, um, you know, why they're related and so on, they would say because they're eukaryotes, because the common ancestor of these two things was a eukaryote. If you're talking about, for example, a whale and a dog, then the common ancestor would be a mammal. That would be well, the most recent common ancestor would be a mammal. So I guess as much the disagreement here would be
If you get a
how
big enough
these.
circle, yeah, you're right. You could fit anything into that circle. But a lot of that circle and a lot of what you're putting into that circle is based on inference, assumption,
Right,
storytelling.
right. So let me just continue though. I guess the disagreement here is to you would say that dogs produce dogs, but sometime in the distant past, the dogs came from something that was non-dog. I guess that's the disagreement there, right?
You're saying a
So I'm asking
monophyletic.
you if what about what
Well,
about
I just want to show you that I know that the law of monophyly will say you can never outgrow your ancestry, and that a monophyletic taxon is defined as one that includes the most recent common ancestor of a group of organisms and all of its descendants, right? So a eukaryote will never stop being a eukaryote. A
right,
mammal will never stop being a mammal. A
right,
carnivore is not going to stop being a carnivore. So even a dog, say in a million years, but it's still a dog. It's
right,
still a eukaryote. You know what I mean? I
right? So
understand that.
that's
A
correct.
lot of it, the law of monophyly is more consistent with biblical
But
creation, special
okay.
creation.
So let's see. Where do you think that the law of monophyly conflicts with um, universal common ancestry? Where does it really conflict?
I it's that you can only go so far back in time. So, for example, okay, dogs produce dogs, right?
Right.
Bacteria produce bacteria. Evolutionists are going to say bacteria and dogs are related through common ancestry. Why? Some similarities. You're going to look at a lot of it is going to be based on inference, storytelling. You can only go so far back.
Right.
Does
So
dog come from then emotion? What you're going to say a wolf, and I'm going to say a wolf is still a dog. What did a wolf ultimately come from? If you go back far enough in time, ultimately wolves, whales, pine trees, and cats will celled organism, a bacteria-like organism. That's what I mean by you're going time in a realm that's just not scientific, observable, demonstrable. So that's what I mean. I understand the law of monophyly, but up to a point.
okay. So right. So I'm asking, where does it conflict with evolution? Not what you disagree with, but where do you think it conflicts with evolution? I know you disagree with the overarching theory of evolution. I understand that, but I want to know where it conflicts. I guess as much usually you say that dogs produce dogs, but um, long ago and far away, dogs coming from non-dogs would falsify the law of monophyly, or at least doesn't sync with the
Is
law
a
of monophyly.
bacteria-like organism? Is that a non-dog?
A bacteria-like organism is a non-dog, correct?
But you're saying that a bacteria-like organism evolving into a dog over time, incremental changes directly, indirectly, regardless, break or contradict with the law of monophyly is what you're saying, right?
No, I'm asking if that was what you were saying. If you think that would conflict with the law of monophyly.
I'm saying that probably according to evolutionary theory, because monophyly, according to you, that probably doesn't contradict it. But all I'm saying is dogs will produce dogs. Dogs will adapt to the cold, to the heat, is adaptation, but that's all you're going to see. Any large scale observable change that would give you any real demonstrable evidence that a bacteria like organism evolved slowly over time into something like a dog. Now, I know you're going to have a way of, like, for example, tell the audience why a bacteria like organism evolving into a whale over time, successive generations, changes in allele frequencies and populations over time. Tell the audience why that doesn't contradict with the law of monophyly.
Okay. So again, the whale would still remain to the clade it came from. So if it came from a bacteria-like organism, like a prokaryote, well, a eukaryote is a modified prokaryote with the nucleus and so on. The whale would still be a member of that clade. So a whale is literally a type of eukaryotic. Well, it's a eukaryote, a multicellular eukaryote behaving like a whale. So that's pretty much what a whale is.
For example, you said a eukaryote is just a modified prokaryote. And prokaryotic cells, they don't contain a nucleus or any other membrane bound organelle, right? Now, you said modified prokaryote. Have we ever seen a prokaryote evolve into a eukaryote?
No, we've never seen that in real time. No.
What makes you think that believing a prokaryote can evolve into a eukaryote is scientific? And doesn't that break down your law of monophyly? If a prokaryote does not contain a nucleus, can evolve into a eukaryote, which would be you, me, insects, whales, fungi, plants, whatever. How is that contradictory to the law of monophyly? That's a completely different. That's a large scale change. So explain that.
Right. That's the thing. The law of monophyly is to do with descendants
Right.
and ancestry. So it doesn't matter how much you've changed. The law of monophyly doesn't say anything about change. If, for example, we have a dog that, for some reason, evolves to be aquatic, like a whale, it will still be a dog. It will still remain within the dog clade,
Yeah,
regardless
and
of if
I understand
it
that.
changes. Yeah, regardless of how much it's have changed, it would still remain a dog. Like, for example, birds. Birds may not look as a typical dinosaur, but because they descended from a dinosaur lineage, then by derivation, they are dinosaurs.
Right. So, what I would say to that would admitted that we've never seen a prokaryote evolve into a eukaryote. And then I understand that the evolutionists have a lot of ideas, a lot of beliefs, a lot of stories. And what I'm saying, and what Ken Hovind said in this debate, is we're not really interested in ideas, beliefs, storytelling, things we have to imagine may have happened. Um, a dog today can evolve, can change through limited means, because we can see that natural selection and mutations are very limited. And that's why I don't like to go to the stories. I like to go to a real-time example. And that's why a lot of the time I like to talk about Lenski's long-term E. coli experiment, because if you're going to say that over enough time a bacteria-like organism can evolve into a whale, some changes today in some type of evolutionary experiment where that might give us a hint that maybe that's true. But we don't see that. The changes we see, as you know, are degenerative, loss of pre-existing functional systems. Because, and give me your thoughts on this, in this experiment, all 12 experimental populations, the functional bacterial genome shrank. It literally has less. So that resulting bacterial strains They're still the same species for one, but they've actually been seriously damaged. So as a creationist, why should we believe an ancestry? I understand the law of monophyly. I think I showed you that I do. A mammal is not going to stop being a mammal. A dog's not going to stop being a dog. A eukaryote's never going to stop being a eukaryote, according to evolutionary theory. But why should we believe that that's true? Go ahead.
All right. So again, it's just to do with ancestry and so on. You just can't outgrow your ancestry. It doesn't even have to do with evolutionary theory. If you want to do with creationism, same thing. Whatever the original kind was, all the descendants would remain that kind. You just could never outgrow your ancestry. It's
Well,
impossible. You can't do it.
I, I'm just saying what we observe in real time really is dogs produce dogs. You can get dogs to adapt to the cold, dogs to adapt to the heat, but you're never going to
Right.
get a dog to grow wings and fly. But yet there's animals that exist with wings
Right.
called birds. You're never going to get a dog as big as an elephant. You're never going to get a dog as small as a flea. There's animals that exist that are as big as elephants and small as fleas, like fleas and elephants. So I understand the law of monophyly and I understand universal common ancestry. But what we're looking for is actual evidence that's demonstrable, testable, something we can retest at the end of the day, something that can be falsified. And I'm pointing you to an experiment that is extremely significant for the opposite reasons, because we have not seen any forward evolution at all. And the effect of this experiment, Lenski's bacterial experiment, has been reductive evolution. That's what creationists predict. That's what creationists expect.
Okay. So let me see. You said a lot. In regards to the limits of evolution, a dog indeed can become as big as an elephant, not in its current form though. It would need certain adaptations to. It's not like getting a dog on Zoom. It's you have to change certain things so it would allow the dog to be that large and operate in its environment. For example, these large organisms like elephants and so on, they have the legs and so on. They're more column-like, and the bone structures and so on is made so they can withstand the weight. Taking a dog in its current form and just enlarging it to the size of an elephant wouldn't work. You need to change the um, the anatomy. Um, for example, to get
Well,
as big as a
we have.
whale.
So are you saying
Yeah,
that there's a physical limit? Unless there's some significant
right.
anatomical or morphological change, you're not going to get a dog we see today to get as big as a whale, is what you're saying. There has to be some type of, well, realistically,
Right.
some
So,
type of large scale evolutionary change in order to make
to
that possible, right?
right to get as big as a whale, the whales are large. These are blue whales and so on. They're that large because of the environment in great part by the environment they occupy. The physics is different, so they can be that large and operate in the environment. No mammal, no land mammal, however, could become that large. They would succumb to gravity. So, if you'd like to get the dog as big as a whale, you'd have to change the physiology and again maybe the environment to have it live in an aquatic environment, and then it is possible to get it that large. But they can't become too large. I don't think. I think a blue whale is a limit on animal size actually. Maybe if you want to get larger, you may have to become like a plant. Um, but yeah, I think a whale is the limit on animal size.
Right,
But there
right.
are there are
So,
there are a lot of physical limits to evolution. Correct. That's why you don't see certain things in nature, for example.
and I understand, that that's typical evolutionary storytelling. But what we're saying, when we say that dogs produce dogs, pine trees produce pine trees, whales produce whales, and yes, they're all eukaryotes, and yes, they're all affected by, they have a lot of similarities and dissimilarities. But at the end of the day, for you to say that dogs, whales, and pine trees are actually related, it's not science. It's actually anti-science and anti-common sense. And I've pointed to a real-time evolutionary experiment, a long-term evolutionary experiment. And this famous experiment has powerfully demonstrated that the mutation selection process has very serious limitations. And you just admitted that there are limitations. And in order to overcome some of those limitations, changing environments, you'd have to look into the past, obviously, and type of way that that would even be possible. But at the end of the day, that's why if you watch this debate, a lot of the times Ken Hovind's opponents, they appeal to deep time. Well, it takes too long. That's the thing. Time's their god. And I notice evolutionists, they seem to
No,
think, just one sec, evolutionists seem to think that time is the hero of the plot, but it's actually the enemy of the plot because everything we see, everything's going downhill. You're not going to take your fish to fisherman, no matter how much time you have. Emotion, I'll give you 1,000,000,000,000 years, man.
oh, okay, that's it. Oh man, I forgot what I was going to say. Um, right. So, in regards to the limits of evolution, there are physical limits, biochemical limits. There are a lot of limits to evolution. That would explain why things we don't see certain things in nature. For example, we don't see things like a Pegasus or a griffin because evolution can't produce these things. Or, for example, you won't see uh, mammary glands on an amphibian or cellulose walls in animal cells. But you would see that in the design world, however. If you look at Pokemon, for example, they mix characters in organisms, they mix plants and animals together, get things like Bulbasaur and so on. That is impossible in an evolutionary scheme. It is quite possible to design an animal with cellulose walls in its cells. Evolution can't do that. That's why you don't see it. Evolution doesn't only explain the limits of evolution. Doesn't only explain what we see; it explains what we don't see as well. So that's why I can predict with certainty that, for example, we would never find any vertebrate with the optic nerve connecting at the back of the retina because evolution doesn't rewire things like that. It just has to work with what it has. Just like the uh, the recurrent laryngeal nerve, it's looped that way, but evolution doesn't rewire things like that, so it has to remain that way. You can predict that we would never find anything without the loop, right? Because that's how evolution works. Um, what else I was going to say? Yeah, so basically, so the limits of evolution dictates what species looks like. And that's why they look like the way they look like today. You don't see an amphibian with feathers, for example. Again, that's impossible under an evolutionary scheme. You don't see, uh, for example, hemoglobin. You don't find it in invertebrates. That level of complexity doesn't convergently evolve multiple times. It doesn't happen that way. Um, Only if designed, though, then it is possible for that to happen. And that is usually one of the criterions I would ask for if someone wanted to show me that species are being designed, then show me something that would not fit an evolutionary scheme, that would falsify phylogeny and would show that definitely this thing had to be, I mean, if not designed by a god, at least designed by some other means other than evolution.
And so I don't see why you believe creationists would predict that because if what we're proposing at the time of creation, for one, God would have created two human beings, Adam and Eve, okay, with the pre-existing functional DNA differences, the created heterozygosity that would give them the potential to adapt. And a lot of it not even based on mutations. You can use recombination, gene conversion, genetic drift, migration. All of these mechanisms can lead to rapid speciation quickly. In animals, it looks like God gave animals, especially if the original created kinds of animals were populations, not just two, right, like Adam and Eve. He's given them the ability to vary and change more than humans, Adam and Eve, for example. But the law of monophyly would apply. Therefore, the changes, they're still going to be limited. And the changes that you're looking for that apparently would falsify evolution, why you'd expect the changes since creation different than that. There's going to be limits within the change, within the changes, within the adaptations we see from the created kinds. You also mentioned predictions. Well, for one, in the fossil record, if you're going to make predictions, if it seems like evolutionists will make so many predictions, one or two are bound to come true, and then for all the ones that don't come true, changed. The fossil record in general, 95% of it, it's exactly what the evolutionists purport. It's not very consistent. You see stasis more consistent with an intelligent design. Yeah, you can point to some rare anomalies, some mosaics, for example, whether it's Tiktaalik, whether it's Archaeopteryx, whether it's the so-called reptile mammals. But at the end of the day, we would predict based on the design model some mosaics, some interesting creatures. And creationists are making predictions too. But yeah, I know you can point to some predictions here and there, but the amount of predictions, emotion, that are proven to be wrong, the few that may prove to be right, it's not going to offset. It's not going to offset the tremendous amount of devices that evolutionists have employed over the years. They've been wrong on so many things. Everything we see in genetics and genomics is just contradictory to what evolutionists have always proposed. So, that would be my response. I don't know why you'd expect. I noticed that the other day with Raw Matt, you said, it is interesting that we've never seen speciation within humans because it takes too long. But then we see it in animals. Off the bat, I was thinking, like, obviously, with what we see, there's a greater chance for diversity in animals. But we see low genetic diversity in humans, just like you admitted. That's why it takes too long to see speciation events in humans in observable time. But that's exactly what we'd predict: low genetic diversity.
Okay, so I'm not talking about the variations within the kind that would I don't expect them to vary that in a way that would falsify the law of monophyly. I'm talking about the designs themselves, the way things are designed. That's why, for example, creationists have a difficult time in distinguishing the designs from the design from natural variation. Um, if, for example, we find, let's say, um, let me see. Okay, let's see, for example, there are apes and so on with prehensile tails. That's tails they use for grasping and so on. If by any chance we find an animal, a vertebrate, instead of a prehensile tail, they have like a hand at the end of it, that will falsify phylogeny because there is no evolutionary mechanism that can turn the end of a tail into a hand without any transitions. So you must have a transition for that. It's funny that they use it for a hand, but they don't have a hand there. I don't know, but that's how it is. Um, let's say, for example, again with amphibians, if we find amphibians with feathers, for example, the feathers can be used for beauty and so on, but it's never found there. Evolution can't produce that, and for some reason, it seems that all the things that we would not expect to find in evolution, we never see them. Like again, an amphibian with feathers, or an amphibian with mammary glands, or
I don't
uh,
understand why you'd expect to see an amphibian with feathers. That's the type of change that, as creationists, we wouldn't
no,
expect either. There's no genetic information.
not
What's that? Go
right. I'm
ahead.
not talking about the chain. I'm talking about the design, the original design.
Right. Why would are you assuming God's design? But because it looks like a lot of what you're saying too is pointing to bad design. I wouldn't design
No,
things
no, no.
this way.
It's not bad design. It's designs that don't fit an evolutionary scheme. They would never exist under an evolutionary scheme. They could never exist, and that's why we don't find them.
It wouldn't exist.
That's
It
why.
wouldn't exist under a creation, a special creation scheme either. We're
No,
not going to expect
well,
amphibians to.
just for aesthetic purposes. Remember, feathers is not always used for flight. You can just have just some feather-like structures on the amphibian. Just that. That alone would falsify evolution. You don't find that. Just you can have just on the head of the amphibian, for example. Just finding that would falsify evolution. However, in design things, when people design their own worlds and so on, you'd find these things. For example, in Avatar, the Navi, they have these sex organ things in their heads, coming from their heads. If we find any species, any vertebrate with that kind of apparatus coming from its head, then it would falsify evolution, because there is no mechanism that can turn the head of a vertebrate that could produce a sex organ out of the head of a vertebrate. However, when you design things, and a person design their own world within the movie, then you can design whatever you please, because the law of the phylogeny, the principles of phylogeny doesn't apply. That's why, for example, the Navi, they have 4 limbs, but all the other animals have 6 limbs. That's not how it works with evolution. With vertebrates in particular, they all have this 4 limb structure because that's what they inherited. There would be no hexapods, because evolution can't produce a hexapod on top of a tetrapod body structure. There is no mechanism to do that. That's why I don't find it. But in Avatar, because the Navi and the animals within there were designed, and they are not limited to phylogeny, then you could design them any which way. The same thing with Pokemon. You would find all different types of designs that would make no sense in an evolutionary scheme. Can't be produced. You would see animals with flowering parts, for example, like a Bulbasaur. It has a flowering part on its back. Any animal would be fine with a flowering part on its back would falsify evolution, because, again, there's no mechanism to get a back to produce a flowering part. Um, or like when we're talking about a prehensile hand, there are I forgot the name of the show, but there is like a monkey, and instead of having a regular tail, at the end of the tail it has a hand. But it has a hand because the person designed it that way. The person, when you design things, you're not limited to phylogeny, so you could design things however you'd like. That doesn't have to necessarily make sense in an evolutionary scheme. But what I'm saying is that what we see in go ahead.
Oh, I would say that that would be true, except for the very fact that they shall bring forth after their kind is phylogeny.
Right.
So that they tie in together. Falsifying you would falsify us.
Right. It seems like you're. Well, here, just one sec, because it seems like you're assuming God's original design, how things should look, and yet, like Matt said, they shall bring forth after their kind. So an amphibian is always going to produce an amphibian. A reptile is always going to produce a reptile. A bird's always going to produce a bird. So I don't know why you're asking for such unreasonable.
No,
Evidence.
I'm not talking about what they bring forth. I'm talking about the original kind itself. So if God was to create an amphibian with feathers, I'm not asking for an amphibian to produce feathers. I'm not like
but he
example,
didn't. But he never did create an amphibian with feathers.
I'm sorry.
Do we see amphibians with feathers?
No, we don't see any. But listen, there are many organisms to be discovered. I'm saying there is.
Have you seen a platypus before?
Right, a platypus.
I think God created a platypus just to show how stupid evolution is. What did a platypus evolve from?
Okay. Mammals, both birds and mammals descended from reptilian form. So the platypus has these reptilian characteristics, the eggs and so on, because we are derivative from reptiles. The bill of the platypus is not a duck bill. It's just a bill. It's made up of a different structure. However, if it was a duck bill made up of the same structure, then that would falsify evolution.
Like Matt said, we, according to our model and our understanding of bringing forth, of special creation, we wouldn't assume these types of hybrids that you're looking for. I mean, for example, look at a car. What does a car have? A car has a battery that delivers the electricity needed to run your vehicle's electrical components. You got a radiator, an alternator, front axle, brakes, front steering, suspension. Look at a boat. What does a boat have? A boat has a propeller. What does a propeller do? It rotates and powers a boat forward or backward. You've got a port, a bow, a stern. I don't know. I'm not a boat expert, but at the end of the day, seems like you're going to assume that we should find some parts on a boat.
No, no,
That
that's
wouldn't make any
that's
sense.
not even that. For example, cars. Very
Is
good.
there a propeller on a car?
Um,
Wait. Is
no,
there a car that has a propeller that you can think of?
well, you don't need a propeller on a car. That's I'm not talking about functional things. That's for aesthetics because there are certain things people creationists would assign to aesthetics. An animal would have some, you know, frills or whatever, just for style, not necessarily functional per se, but for style. Right? They would say that's part of the design. That's okay. So that's what I'm asking. I'm not asking to see a flying frog, although there are actually flying frogs. Um, yeah. Um,
How come? Just wait a second. Just wait a second. How come in all observable history, we really have seen humans produce humans? I predict that you can go to any hospital today, tomorrow, the next day, and humans are going to be producing baby humans. How come? Recorded human history, that's all we've seen. Where's the speciation events?
right. So in recorded human history, you're looking for humans to speciate. No, it takes a while for mammals, especially of our size and their
We see
reproduction rate, to
speciation events all the
speciate.
time in
Right, in
various
animals
animals.
of they're usually smaller animals like reptiles and so on. They do that, or insects and so on. They do that. They readily do that because they reproduce fast and they can speciate. However,
So do
at present,
bacteria. So do bacteria. And what have we seen
right,
in the Linsky experiment? Bacteria produce more bacteria. Everything we see
right,
in
they
observable science,
right.
that bacteria and humans are not related. We don't see that type
No,
of
no, no,
change.
no, 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 no. The bacteria produce bacteria because, again, the law of monophyly would always,
I understand the law of monophyly.
again, bacteria is not a species; it's an entire domain. The bacteria
But you believe
produce.
at some point, emotion, a bacteria like organism gave rise to a whale through incremental
Right, gave
changes,
rise to a whale.
successive. Right, you just said right. We look
Right,
at we look at real-time experiments, the largest evolutionary experiment. There's no forward evolution. We see changes that are based on degenerative, adaptive changes, everything consistent with creation and contradictory to. I don't think you understand our whole point and the point of what Ken Hovind was trying to drive across these guys. We understand what you believe. We understand the law of monophyly. We understand the stories, the ideas, the imagination. Okay, that's fine. You can hold to those views. We're not against. You can believe whatever you want. Land of the free, home of the slave. But it's not science. Everything in observable science, but you can still hold to it. It's just not science. We can talk about stories and ideas all day and how you're going to get a dog as big as a whale or how you're going to get a dog as small as a pygmy mouse. I understand that.
okay.
Forced upon us as if it's science. Okay? That's
So
the facts. It really is.
okay.
Humans produce
So
humans. At what point are
right.
humans going to speciate? Just answer that question. At what point in a million years, what are humans going to look like? At what point are we going to see the type of change that will give us an idea or a hint at large scale evolution being true?
Okay. Um, at what point? I don't know the exact point. Humans may indeed speciate, however, not in the way you're thinking, like a lineage splitting event. Because of how humans interact globally, I don't think that humans would be able to speciate in that way. Um, However, there is um, like vertical speciation, where the species would become a new species over time instead of by splitting. If you compare them to the ancestors, then it would obviously be a different species. So I think that could happen. But as opposed to the human race splitting to the point where they become a different species, humans, we don't currently behave like that. So I don't expect for the human race to speciate anytime soon. Um, we wouldn't be isolated long enough for that to happen. So I can't tell exactly when it would happen. Obviously, I can't do that. Evolution doesn't even predict that how
I,
long it takes for speciation to happen. It just says
But you believe, right, emotion. But I want to drive this point across for you and the audience.
right.
You believe, and I put a capital B on believe, that humans today descended from non-humans long ago and
Right.
far away, and
How
ultimately
long?
a
Hey, hold on.
bacteria-like organism
Ah,
evolved into eukaryotes, and then eukaryotes evolved into whales, humans, birds, pine trees. This is what we're trying to tell you: is you can believe whatever you want, but the ideas, the beliefs, the storytelling, emotion. It's great and all. It's entertaining. I used to be entertained by it as well. But what we see in regards to humans in general is that all human beings are profoundly similar genetically. That points directly to Adam and Eve. If you only started with two people, that restricts the diversity today. This is a big reason why I don't understand the thinking process of theistic evolutionists who have science on their side, but yet they want to believe that apes and humans are deep time. I'm sure you can agree. Any large population are going to accumulate enormous numbers of mutations according to evolutionary history. That results in enormous amounts of genetic diversity. So that's a serious problem for you, a serious problem for evolutionary theory, because as I've stated, mankind, and as you've agreed with, has very limited. The Bible predicted this. It's what we expect. Death and demise of the evolutionary bottleneck theory that you'd have to look to. And of course, you'd look to the out of Africa theory, but that means the death and demise of the out of Africa theory as well. So all known observable evidence that's demonstrable, testable, repeatable is consistent with what we believe. And that's the whole point. If you're going to call anything science, predictions and the retrodictions. Yeah, you got a couple predictions you can, pick out, going to counterbalance the overwhelming amount of flawed and failed predictions. Go ahead, emotion.
okay. So where do I begin?
did you
Right.
say they're isolated? That's why they can't speciate? Humans are pretty much everywhere.
No, I said they're not. They wouldn't have time to isolate themselves long enough.
Oh, to isolate themselves. Okay, my bad.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry about that. Maybe the accent. Um, right. So again, for example, just as how you can get a broccoli or kale or whatever from a mustard, it doesn't have to be
A
long and far
plant
away.
from a
That
plant,
that
but you believe that plant ultimately descended from a bacteria-like organism long ago and far away. Just want to throw that out there. Yes, plants produce
right,
plants.
right. So you can always
Animals produce.
interject with
Go
that.
ahead. Take as much time as you need. I
Okay,
just wanted to throw that out there.
okay, fine. Right. So you can get something from a non-something, like a dog from a non-dog, or a broccoli from a non-broccoli, by means of descent with modification.
Well, man,
That's how evolution works.
I don't
It doesn't
think
have to be
God.
long and far
We're
away.
no, I
That
understand.
took a couple
I'm just
years.
saying God doesn't care much about man's classification systems, man's classification ideas, taxonomy, cladistics. A lot of these things, like I've said, they're based on the assumption that universal common ancestry is true, based on a lot of inference. That's all I'm saying. Yes, I understand. The Chihuahua didn't name itself a Chihuahua, and the broccoli didn't name itself broccoli.
Ah, now you get it.
What I'm saying is, if you
Because
took off,
by saying
if you went into a car lot and
right,
took the label off every single cars, Hyundai, Honda, Chevy, Chrysler, Ford, Subaru, whatever, you name it. You're going to see a lot of similarities, a lot of differences. You're going to connect things every which way you can. But without the labels on them, you're going to make a lot of false. That's
Right.
without looking at everything. You're right. You're right. A Great Dane didn't call itself a Great Dane. The whale didn't call itself a whale. And you know, money. You know, nobody remembers the guy who found the fifth Tyrannosaurus Rex. You remember the guy who found the first. Everybody's trying to find any type of change that they can to give this a name for a new species. Classification systems. God doesn't care about the names that we give to all the different varieties that we see. And that's what we mean by kinds. You know. Go ahead. Take as much time as you need.
so you bring up new ideas one after the next. With cars, again, we don't assume cars are related in any way because again, they don't have a mechanism of reproduction.
All
They
right,
don't
so
have a
and this is the
molecule.
why I
They
cut you off is because of
don't
the straw man argument.
have
I'm
a
sorry, because just wait.
molecule.
I want you to go. I want you to go.
Oh shit.
Design model. If you think that we're using modes of transportation to say that they reproduce, because that's always the evolutionist response. Yeah, you're right. They don't reproduce. Reproduction is amazingly complex. That makes the problem worse for you.
Um,
Bring out some
okay.
argument that
Okay.
you
Listen.
think is
Okay.
new to
Listen.
us.
Standing.
Not a novel argument, Emotion. Give us something
Uh,
real. I don't want ideas. Take as much time as you need. I have to interrupt when I hear that type of.
okay. Okay.
Take as much time as you need.
First off, is praise? Are you there? Yeah. So, okay. So listen. This is your channel, so you have to control standing. Okay. This is not standing's channel. This is your channel. So when I speak, I don't want to be interrupted constantly. I don't interrupt at
Well, I mean,
all.
back and pat, yeah, but see, this is not a moderated debate, so I
This
disagree. You
okay.
guys have you go back and forth. Sometimes you'll talk over each other. I mean, that's just part of discussion. So
And you
Yeah.
know what? If Emotion's saying more things wrong in a sentence than words that are in that sentence, I'm going to have to cut them off one or two times, Emotion. So the next time you say that cards don't reproduce and you actually think that that debunks the work of men like Dr. John Sanford, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, who's put forth a beautiful model, a model with testable predictions, and you think that telling us that cars don't reproduce is novel and meaningful to this discussion, the fact that cars don't reproduce is worse for you of a designer anyways, and you're denying this designer. Okay, one single cell is more complicated than the space shuttle. Take as much time as you need. I'm not going to interrupt, but I will comment eventually on every wrong thing that you say. Go ahead. I
Very
won't.
absolutely,
yeah.
yeah, this is not a moderated debate, so I want to make that clear.
I know, but I find standing to be very disrespectful. Trust me, it is disrespectful because I let him talk. I really don't interrupt him. Let him talk, but let me talk. All right.
Let's act like adults here. Emotion, just make your point. Okay, we're wasting time here by you complaining. I corrected you. The correction is over. Please stand corrected. Now take as much time as you need. I'm drinking some water here. I'm relaxing. I'm sitting back, and I'm ready for the ideas, beliefs, storytelling. I'm ready for it. I'm interested. I'm excited. Go ahead.
Okay. So the reason why we don't assume that cars or whatever are related is because one, they don't reproduce. Two, they don't reproduce with variation, and they are not subjected to the principles of descent with modification. They don't have any molecules of heredity, so you can't build a family tree or you can't track their ancestry. They don't um, they they don't abide by the laws of phylogeny. Again, that's why we don't assume that cars do. I'm not saying that this debunks anything. I'm just saying that we don't assume that. That's the reasons why, or some of the reasons why we don't assume that. Okay, so regardless of how similar cars would look, because they don't fit these criteria, then we would never assume they evolved by any kind of Darwinian means. All
I
right.
think they just use that as an analogy, man. That's kind of like a parable in the Bible. They don't mean it. It's just example.
Yeah, I mean, but when we discuss biology, let's just keep it within biology. I hate when people divert to cars and whatever. We're not talking about cars. We know why we don't assume cars evolve. So don't even bring it up.
Oh, we do bring it up because you're trying to classify all forms of life into a nested hierarchy. And I'm trying to tell you and show you that we can do the exact same thing with all the different types of kitchen supplies in my kitchen that I'm sitting in right now, and with all different types of modes of transportation. But the funny thing is, even though we can fit boats, we can fit airplanes, we can fit sedans, hatchbacks, SUVs, crossovers, modes of transportation into a beautiful nested hierarchy. But we know that boats are not related to sedans. In the same way that you can fit your whale into a nice, neat nested hierarchy with man, with apes, with plants, with bacteria, that doesn't mean and that doesn't demonstrate that they're all related, because it's all based on assumption, it's all based on inference, imagination, and storytelling. That's the point. It's a demonstration of how
So
flawed evolutionary theory is. Go ahead.
there are mathematical equations to calculate it to measure the parsimony of any given phylogeny. Cards, no one produces any neat nested hierarchy with vehicles.
Yes, you do. I can show you. I just did.
When you create a nested hierarchy, when you do a phylogeny, especially morphologically, you have to count every character. That's why they use thousands of characters to build a tree. Um, that's the same thing RJ was trying to say, that they when creationists build a tree, they don't use all the characters, they use some. If you want to build a tree using cards, you need to use every single character in the card, every single thing, and you build a tree off of that. But cars, for example, again, for example, Volkswagen, I think they started off the model with the engines at the back, and now they have it at the front. That would mess up your phylogeny, your cladogram, because that kind of shift there doesn't happen in an evolutionary cladogram. You'd have to explain where the shift come from. How do you move an engine from the back to the front by, an evolutionary means? But we don't see that in nature. We don't see body parts in one type of organism here, and then, for example, in vertebrates, and then completely different orientation in another type of vertebrate. It doesn't work like that. It's the same thing, just a modified version of what's already there. You don't, for example, you don't see the brain of an organism, vertebrate in its chest cavity or whatever. That's like moving the engine from the front to the back or the back to the front. For cars, for example, you can change the metal it's made from without any transition. You could just have this kind of metal and then change that kind of metal, or this kind of engine and change it for that kind of engine without any transition in the engine. You don't do that with living things. You need to modify it step by step. Design things doesn't need a step by step design, because they're not made step by step. They're just made. You just have a new design. Okay, you have something here. Okay, I want to make it of a different metal, a different engine. We're going to put the engine at the front. We're going to have two doors instead of four. We're going to have a open rooftop, and we're going to just make things like that. Design things can't work like that. That's why you don't build a phylogeny using that. No creationist ever built a cladogram in the same way um, taxonomists do with cars. I've seen simple versions of it where they use like 12 characters, 13 characters. That's child's play compared to the thousands of characters that's used to build an actual cladogram in evolution. The living dinosaur actually went over that already with Once Forgiven, Now Free, and you can see the difference. And if you really wanted to make, you tried to even attempt to make phylogeny using cars and so on. You use planes, same thing, because some planes would have more engines than some. You don't just get engines in living things. You don't just get body parts all of a sudden. It needs to form gradually. So no design things, no houses, no cars or whatever can't fit any kind of nested hierarchy, in the same way living things do. It just doesn't happen. And that's why, for example, it's easy to distinguish between cars, but it's extremely difficult for creationists to distinguish between living things. That's, for example, I asked you to distinguish or to, if all the subphylum Crustacea, pan Crustacea, sorry, if they're all related, and how do you distinguish between them? They're literally almost the same thing. All crustaceans are almost the same body plan buildup. Even crabs, although they look a bit different to lobsters, There are crabs that do have the kind of tail-like structure, like a lobster. And if you go further back, there are literal lobster-looking crab-like things in the fossil record. So that's why I asked you to, you know, distinguish them. It's easy to do that with cards and so on, but not with living things because of the smooth um, gradations you would find between them, especially with crustaceans and so on.
You finished? Okay, so right off the bat, it's not a nice, neat, and organized tree. Okay, tree of life, like you stated. Okay, first of all, hierarchies in relation to evolutionary theory, phylogenetic systematics. It's all based on a primary assumption that universal common ancestry is true to begin with. We can look at observable and demonstrable data. We can look at the long-term evolutionary experiment, Lenski's experiment. We can see that there's no forward evolution taking place. Therefore, all the assumptions, all the connections, all the inferences made based on phylogeny, trees, for example, it's just not true. It's just storytelling. Even if you look up a phylogenetic tree, how to read a phylogenetic tree in regards to the fact that tree is trying to represent, the evolutionary history of species. And they'll tell you that, this is what we think. This is how we think these specific species evolved from a common ancestor through a series of, divergence events. Okay, right off the bat, you said that there's some inconsistencies with modes of transportations and the nested hierarchies that we can demonstrate from those. And I'm sure there are. But at the end of the day, whenever there's an inconsistency for convergent evolution is invoked, rescue device after rescue device, because they're not going to question the primary assumption. They're going to force fit all new data into the primary assumption. Now, you said that we can't build or we can't demonstrate a neat and organized nested hierarchy based on the design model. Well, as I've told you, the design model does predict nested hierarchies. And the classification of life, two modes of transportation, and how we, as humans, classify different modes of transportations based on similarities forming hierarchies. For example, humans, pigs, rats, and ducks are all land dwelling. Now, even though according to our model, they're separate kinds, since they are all land dwelling, they can share similar nested hierarchies or designs. So at the end of the day, if you're starting from our starting point, it doesn't take much reflection, emotion at all to see that our model does predict relative genetic hierarchies that are actually. So that's why when you say, cars don't reproduce, we know that. But the thing is, our starting point is that the God of the Bible designed the entire universe. And obviously this includes the various kinds of biological life that exist in it. So we would obviously expect, and I hope you would agree, that we'd also predict to find that life fits a design pattern. So since we as humans are then made in God's image, we're going to get a sense for what kinds of design patterns God might have used. We're going to do this by studying. We're going to examine the patterns that result from human design. So we've actually seen, and we can actually demonstrate that nested hierarchies in general are, for the most part, agnostic to the question of universal common ancestry. For example, okay, let's look at cars. Every single car is unique, but all cars do share a set of features. Okay, for example, a certain range of height from the ground, 4 doors, 4 wheels, lack of a cab bed, whatever, you name it. We can go on and on. But if we actually shrink the list of features, just like you would do the same thing with, say, humans, and then apes, and then dogs, and just bring them all into a nested hierarchy, we're doing the same thing. We're shrinking the list of features, okay, emotion. Now we can bring in SUVs and trucks into this same group. I'm sure everybody can see where I'm going with this, okay? Trucks, as we know, they're higher off the ground than cars. And since most trucks consist of a cab bed, which a sedan lacks, the number of features shared among cars and trucks is less than those shared among just cars. So we can go on and on. We can then bring in motorcycles and so on. And just like biological life, technically, the more vehicles, organisms, and species we actually bring in and group and throw into our transportation classification system, the smaller the list of shared features becomes. And that's exactly like the Linnaean classification system, okay? So at the end of the day, nested hierarchies in general are agnostic. But when it comes to biological nested hierarchies, there are so many contradictions and inconsistencies. And that's why convergent evolution is invoked over and over again. So it's not as neat and organized as you say. And all observable data disproves evolution. So you can show us all these different trees, but as Ken Hovind says, they're just lines on paper. Now, sometimes lines on paper do demonstrate and do give us valuable data. For example, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's LMN haplogroups, his mitochondrial DNA tree of humanity, makes predictions, retrodictions, they're testable. Those aren't just lines on paper. But since what we know about observable empirical scientific data is that evolution can't be true, say, phylogenetic trees, those are just lines on paper. You can believe that they actually show important, but it's not science, emotion.
Okay, so the classification you were talking about with the vehicles is indeed Linnaean taxonomy. It's not a phylogeny. A phylogeny. Oh, just one more. Right. The classification we're talking about, where you would use less and less characters to get a bigger group, that's taxonomy. The phylogeny is you still use all the characters to build a tree. And again, you won't get a consistent tree. It would be all over the place. Characters would jump all over the place. With evolution, when it comes to convergent evolution, the trait in question that is convergent, it comes from something else. Whereas in cars and so on, it doesn't have to come from anywhere, because cars are just made in their current form. They didn't evolve. So, that, for example, the wings of bats and birds, they both evolved from a similar structure. They emerged from the same structure. But for example, there were once a car that was built with wings. The car didn't evolve the wings; it just attached the wings to the car. Living things, they don't just see characters as like whole structures like that appearing on a species from nowhere. They would gradually evolve. You would see the steps of them. For example, like the bird's wing would evolve. You'd see the hand and the wrist and so on changing until it becomes a bird wing. Same thing with bats. So they're not all the transitions aren't there, but because bats are hard to fossilize. But there are some other transitions of bats. The wings are a bit different in the earlier forms. What was I going to say? Actually, I forgot exactly what I was going to say. Right. So the lines on paper. You said phylogeny is just lines on paper. Um, it's strange that you say that, because creationists do accept phylogeny to some undefined point. Raw Matt, for example, made a video where he was trying to, debunk Aaron Raw's phylogeny challenge in his attempt to debunk it. He would actually use evolutionary cladograms of phylogeny. So it seems like the ones he's using is valid, but yet to hear a creationist explain what makes a given phylogeny valid and how did it distinguish between valid phylogenies and invalid ones, and where exactly does phylogeny break down. um, within a given group of animals. So, for example, as I give the crustaceans, are all crustaceans related, and if not, where exactly does it break down, if any? Or for example, all palm trees, or um, let me see, uh, all orchids, for example. Are they all related? How do we know? Where does the phylogeny break down per se? Um, Sometimes I hear creationists say, well, it breaks down at the family level. Well, except for the exception of humans and other things. I would point out many families for them, and they would say, well, no, at least that one doesn't count. I would show them the family of cucurbitacea, that's watermelons and pumpkins and uh, cucumbers and so on. They're all within the same family, but creationists don't accept that they're related. Most of them don't. Um, I'd show them the family of grass and bamboo and so on, and corn. They're all within the same family, but creationists don't accept they're related. Even like onions and garlics and leeks. Again, that's actually a genus, and creationists don't accept that they're related.
If I
So
may interject
it's
real quick, you can finish what you're going to say, but I want to make something real quick, or say something real quick. I want Matt to respond to those questions. So can we wrap this up? We can finish this whole dialogue another time, but we need to wrap this up pretty quick. So I want to let you guys know that.
I think what would be good is we'll allow Emotion to finish what he's saying uninterrupted. Do what you got to do. I'll literally keep my response really, really quick, and I'll even give you the last words. Emotion, make your last response extremely quick, and then we'll call it because we. It's been fun. It looks like it's been a good hour back and forth between
Yeah,
us.
I
But then
really
yeah,
enjoy this discussion you guys are having. I learn a lot of things from you, standing for truth, and you strengthen my faith in intelligent design and creation. So, I mean, I owe a lot to you. So, thank you very much for what you do, and so we'll go from there.
brother. No, I agree. So finish what you're saying, Emotion. I'll say something real quick. We'll even give you the last word since you're the atheist, I guess, in this room. So to be respectful, and then we'll move on to what Praise said, the questions. Those are important.
Oh, okay, cool. Also, basically, is that creation would argue that phylogeny is invalid or is incorrect, but they would accept it up to a certain point. So basically, they would like to know where phylogeny breaks down, which is practically one aspect of the phylogeny challenge. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, and I would just say, yes, convergent evolution, of course, um, is based on the fact that there are inconsistencies and a lack of uniqueness of the phylogenetic tree. So I'm just saying evolutionists explain those away with convergent evolution. At the end of the day, they're just invoking convergent evolution to avoid addressing the failure of the phylogenetic tree. I mean, you can just look at whales, dolphins, and bats. They're the only mammals that have echolocation systems. And on the basis of gross anatomy, the whales and dolphins are classified closer to the cow and other ruminants than to the bats. But on the basis of their echolocation systems, they should actually belong with bats. So you can look at molecular analysis of, say, the protein Preston that puts whales and dolphins squarely with the bats. So at the end of the day, evidence that the phylogenetic tree that you're talking about doesn't actually represent objective reality and should at the end of the day falsify universal common descent. Now, I did say lines on paper in regards to trees and phylogenetic analysis because yes, phylogeny to an extent. But at some point, especially once you get into the fossil record, a lot of assumptions, inferences are made. I'm using nested hierarchies to show that in general, agnostic to the question of creation, which would predict limited ancestry, and evolution, which would obviously predict and assume universal common ancestry. That's when I say we need to get down to the DNA level. Traits are inherited, not bones found in the dirt. We can look at DNA function. We can look at neutral variation. There's a lot of things we can look at. So that's all I was pointing out. The phylogeny has to break down at some point. Where does it break down? about for hours. So I appreciate everything you put forth there, Emotion. Have the last word.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome there, standing. So I guess we get on to the well, Praise had some questions for Matt, so I guess I'll listen to those.